The day the plague arrived, when one cough doomed a village. Imagine a quiet English village in the spring of 1348. Stone cottages with thatched roofs, sheep grazing lazily on green hills, the distant hum of church bells marking time. Children chase chickens through narrow lanes, blacksmiths hammer iron, and bakers lift warm loaves from wood-fired ovens. It's a life defined by rhythm, faith, and familiarity. But in that fragile peace arrives a stranger, a traveler, bone thin, cloaked in dust, passes through the village gate with a limp and a persistent cough. The villagers greet him kindly. Hospitality is sacred. Bread is offered. A barn corner is cleared for him to rest. But this act of kindness becomes their undoing. The man carries something unseen, something ancient and ruthless, the Black Death. He doesn't know it, but his body is a vessel for Yersinia pestis, the bacterium carried by fleas riding on rats, creatures that stowed away in merchant ships from the east. He might have picked it up in a port city, in a bustling marketplace, or from another dying traveler. Now, it jumps from him to others, perhaps through a flea bite, perhaps through his breath. The science of the time cannot explain what's happening, but the effects arrive fast. Within days, a young girl who played near the barn complains of chills. Her skin burns. Her groin swells with hard, painful lumps. Her parents think it's a fever. They pray, light candles, rub her skin with oils. By morning, she's dead. Her body is hot, then cold, and then still. No one has seen a death so sudden, so unrelenting, and she will not be the last. The village priest performs last rites. He stands in her doorway, swinging a censer heavy with incense. By sundown, he too collapses. The undertaker who handles his body lasts 2 more days. Then the black swellings, buboes, rise along his neck and thighs. He screams in the night before slipping into unconsciousness. By the week's end, 20 are gone. Rumors spread like fire. It's a curse. It's the devil. It's poisoned wells. Some believe it's punishment for sin, for pride, for indulgence. Others whisper of comets in the sky, of foul omens, of witches among them. Panic blooms. Villagers flee into the woods, hoping to escape. But the plague is already in them. They carry it further. The local healer tries everything: leeches, vinegar washes, burning herbs, prayer circles. Nothing works. A mother, terrified for her children, seals the doors and windows with mud and cloth, refusing to let anyone in or out. But one child had already been exposed. Within days, her household is a tomb. The village gravediggers, once young and strong, dig until their fingers bleed. But they cannot keep up. They abandon individual burials, resorting to mass graves. Huge pits are dug on the outskirts of the village, filled with lime and layers of corpses. They do not weep anymore. They are numb. Across Europe, the same scene plays out. From Italian city-states to German towns, from Spanish farmlands to French monasteries. The Black Death doesn't stop. It moves along trade routes like a ghost on the wind. Ships bring it. Merchants bring it. Rats thrive in the filth and chaos of medieval life, and the fleas ride them from house to house. Entire villages vanish from the map. In some places, every inhabitant dies. Crops rot in the fields. Livestock wander untended. Churches remain locked, their clergy dead. Schools close. Markets disappear. No carts rattle through cobbled streets. Just silence. Just plague. In the village, a few survive, those lucky enough to have natural immunity or those who escaped early. But they are not unscarred. A boy who watched his mother convulse in bed now refuses to speak. A farmer finds himself the only one left on his land. The air feels cursed. Every crow seems like a harbinger. Every cough, a threat. What began with a single traveler has now spread across kingdoms. The death toll reaches into the tens of millions. Historians estimate that between 1/3 to 2/3 of Europe's population is wiped out. It's not just a health crisis, It's a collapse. With so few workers left, labor becomes valuable. Serfs begin to demand wages. Landowners panic. The economic system begins to shift. The authority of the church weakens as prayers fail to save the dying. Faith transforms into doubt, and doubt, in time, into inquiry. This devastation lays the strange, painful foundation for future science. But none of that matters to the baker who just lost his wife, or the girl hiding in her attic, clutching a doll while the world decays below. They don't care about social revolutions or wages. They want their families back. They want the nightmare to stop. The psychological scars run deep. Survivors speak of dreams filled with blood, of phantom coughs that never leave their ears, of entire streets that vanish from memory because they can't bear to remember who once lived there. And beneath the soil, across England, France, Italy, are layers of mass graves, bodies that were never named, never honored, just dumped in haste, in fear, in silence. Many of those people were once like us, laughing, hoping, building, all brought down by a single bacterium, carried on a rat, triggered by a stranger's cough. So when you walk through a quiet village today, know this: some of them were never rebuilt. Some are just ruins beneath fields and trees, ghost villages, marked only by the bones that sleep below. And it all began with one traveler and one cough. The morning the Lord's men came to collect. Imagine waking up to the sound of hooves pounding the dirt, not in celebration, but in dread. It's 1291 in rural France, fields brittle with frost, bellies already aching from a failed harvest. And yet, the king's men have come. Clad in chainmail, their banners flapping like warnings in the wind, they rode into villages before sunrise, demanding tribute not in coin, but in grain, livestock, and firewood. This wasn't charity, it was royal taxation, enforced with brutality, justified by law, and extracted without mercy. This real event was not an isolated moment. It was part of a widespread crisis where the crown, desperate to fund foreign wars and noble luxuries, leaned heavily on its poorest subjects. France, in the late 13th century, was undergoing political expansion under Philip IV, also known as Philip the Fair, who sought to strengthen royal authority. But royal power demanded revenue, and the burden fell not on the nobles, not on the clergy, but on the serfs and free peasants who already lived on the edge of starvation. When the Lord's men arrived, it wasn't with parchment and politeness, it was with fists and force. These tax collectors were often accompanied by soldiers who used intimidation and outright violence to extract dues. Villagers who could not pay were stripped of their last goats, the seed grain they needed to survive the next planting, or the very wood meant to keep their families alive through the winter. Those who protested were shackled and taken away, to rot in local lordly prisons or to be made examples of in public squares. What made 1291 particularly brutal was the convergence of political greed and environmental disaster. That year, much of northern France was struck by poor weather, chill rains and early frosts that destroyed crops and made famine a looming threat. In many regions, communal grain stores were already depleted. Monks recorded desperate families boiling bark, grinding acorns into paste, even eating roots meant for pigs. And still, the taxes came. The law was clear. The crown had a right to collect, but rights on parchment meant nothing to those with nothing left to give. Some villagers tried to hide livestock in woods. Others buried grain in dry pits under their floors. But the Lord's men were methodical. They would enter homes uninvited, overturn beds, stab pitchforks into thatched roofs looking for hidden sacks. Resistance was met with the back of a sword, the butt of a spear. If you argued, you were labeled a rebel. If you begged, you were ignored. And this wasn't just rural enforcement, it was policy. Royal decrees from the era made it clear that tax evasion, especially during wartime levies, was punishable by confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. Many villages that had once enjoyed small degrees of autonomy suddenly found themselves under direct rule, their elders stripped of power, their charters revoked. Some communities, once proud and semi-independent, were reduced to nothing more than open-air banks for a king who would never walk their roads. We know this because records from abbeys, local scribes, and even the royal archives detail not just the collection amounts, but the resistance. In one account, from the region of Anjou, a group of villagers barricaded a church with their livestock inside, believing the sanctity of the space would protect them. The Lord's men broke down the doors. They killed 2 farmers in the scuffle. The rest were dragged out and beaten. The priest who protested was threatened with charges of sedition. In another account from the Pyrenees, a woman named Marguerite refused to surrender her only cow. She was elderly, widowed, with no sons to help her work the land. The cow was her lifeline: milk, labor, warmth. When she resisted, they took the cow anyway. Marguerite followed them for miles, pleading. She collapsed on the road. Days later, her body was found near the edge of the forest. There was no trial, no report, no reparation, only silence. This pattern repeated across France, and while the nobles discussed strategy in candlelit halls, peasants were left with famine, fear, and forced obedience. The very same year saw uprisings in parts of Languedoc and Brittany, small rebellions sparked not by ideology, but desperation. These were not warriors. They were farmers with scythes and women with cooking knives who had finally been pushed too far. Of course, rebellion was crushed swiftly. The crown sent reinforcements. Families of resistors were fined further. Some villages were ordered to provide double the taxes as punishment. And in the cruelest irony, some of those who led the resistance were branded traitors to the crown, despite having no political aim beyond feeding their children. And yet, this moment, the morning the Lord's men came to collect, lives on not because of its scale, but because of its intimacy. It was repeated, village by village, family by family. It is remembered not in battlefield glories, but in the silence that followed, the empty barns, the smoldering hearths, the prayers whispered by mothers over sleeping children they didn't know how to feed. Today, we romanticize medieval life with castles and chivalry. But for most people in 1291, life meant surviving the next tax demand. It meant watching everything you built vanish into the saddlebags of armored men who didn't care if your roof caved in tomorrow. It meant learning that law was not justice, and that obedience, no matter how painful, might be the only way to survive another day. Because on that cold morning, when the Lord's men came to collect, they didn't just take grain or goats. They took peace, they took hope, and they reminded the powerless that in the eyes of the powerful, suffering had a price, and it was always paid in full. Lightning struck the church, and the entire village burned. Imagine a quiet village in 12th century Germany, nestled at the edge of dense pine forests and surrounded by golden fields of barley. It was not large, no more than 50 families, their homes made of wattle and daub, their roofs thickly layered with dry thatch. At the village's heart stood its proudest symbol, a modest wooden church. It was simple, unadorned, yet revered. Its steeple, though humble, was the highest point in the village, a finger stretched toward the heavens, inviting protection or destruction. On the evening of June 17th, the sky began to shift. A storm brewed beyond the trees, creeping in with a wind that howled through narrow lanes and snapped shutters open. Children were pulled indoors. Fires were snuffed, doors barred. The priest, Father Ulrich, stood at the church's doorway, watching as the storm massed in the distance. He had seen storms before, tempests that cracked trees and scattered livestock, but this one was different. The sky churned an eerie green. The thunder did not roll. It cracked like iron splitting. As villagers gathered inside the church seeking safety, the first bolt came down. It struck a tree near the fields, splitting it down the middle. Then another. And then, as if the heavens had made a decision, a final searing bolt struck the steeple itself. The lightning found its mark with violent precision. The dry thatch of the roof ignited instantly. Within seconds, flame devoured the wooden spire. Sparks danced high into the stormy air, carried on gusts of wind that turned flickers into infernos. Inside the church, panic exploded. People screamed, pushing toward the doors as fire began to rain from above. The bell tower groaned, its wooden beams crackling, and collapsed with a deafening roar, trapping several villagers beneath smoldering debris. But the fire did not stop there. With the wind at its back, the blaze leapt from rooftop to rooftop, moving faster than any bucket line could contain. Thatched roofs, once symbols of rural life and simplicity, became perfect fuel. In minutes, entire homes were engulfed. Animals stampeded blindly through the smoke. Mothers clutched children and ran into the fields only to find the flames chasing them there as well, jumping fences, crossing hedgerows. The wind had turned malevolent, unpredictable. It pulled flames sideways, down alleyways, even beneath doorways. It seemed to seek life. There was no fire brigade, no stone houses, no reservoir or river nearby, just wooden walls and fear. Contemporary records, scrawled by monks in distant abbeys who heard survivors' accounts, describe how the fire reached such a temperature that metal tools and hinges fused, bones turned to ash. The sound, they said, was like a roaring beast, so loud it drowned out even the screams. By the time the fire died with the storms passing, the village was gone. Every home, every barn, every stable, every cradle, consumed. The scorched remains of livestock lay scattered in fields of soot. The church was reduced to a blackened foundation, and inside it, dozens of charred forms huddled together in a final failed sanctuary. Of the 50 or so families who had lived there, fewer than 10 individuals survived. The fire, though accidental, became a warning passed down through generations. Villagers across the region began reinforcing their churches and homes with stone, those who could afford it. In many places, thatched roofs were banned altogether. Some even began placing iron crosses or church bells on towers, not for decoration, but in the hope that metal would attract or divert future strikes. But for the survivors, no superstition could erase what they'd seen. They spoke of children crying for parents who would never return, of days spent searching the ruins for fragments of life, a cooking pot, a locket, a twisted horseshoe. For months afterward, the smell of smoke lingered in the soil. Crops refused to grow in fields that had once been rich. Some said the land was cursed, others that God had turned his back on them. And then came the harder questions. Why had the church, meant to be their refuge, become the point of ignition? Why had the very place they ran to for salvation become a furnace of death? Was it truly an accident of weather or a sign of divine judgment? Historians today believe it was a tragic convergence of design and nature. Thatched roofs, common in medieval Europe, were cheap and insulative, but catastrophically flammable. The church, being the tallest structure, naturally attracted lightning. And the storm, with its unusual intensity, may have carried enough power to spark a firestorm, a rare but devastating phenomenon where flames create their own wind, spreading with terrifying force. But in 12th century Germany, they didn't have those explanations. All they had were graves and memories. The event echoed through medieval chronicles, not because it was isolated, but because it was a harbinger. In the centuries that followed, lightning-induced fires became more common as villages grew larger and wooden architecture dominated. It wasn't until the 18th century that Benjamin Franklin's invention of the lightning rod offered some protection. But for hundreds of years before that, the heavens remained an unpredictable enemy. And still, on stormy nights in the modern towns that now sit where that village once stood, locals say you can sometimes smell the faintest trace of smoke on the wind. No fire, no sparks, just a memory, drifting from the earth itself. Because history doesn't always live in books, Sometimes it lives in the ground, in the ashes, and in the silence that follows a single lightning strike that changed everything. A rain of blood, the day the sky terrified a village. It began without warning, no thunder, no wind, no omen in the clouds, just the first drops, heavy, red, thick. In the year 1251, the small Italian village of Atri awoke to find the sky weeping crimson. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't symbolic, it was terrifying. Imagine the medieval world. Faith was absolute, science was a whisper, superstition shaped reality. So when blood appeared to fall from heaven, villagers did not reach for explanations. They reached for their rosaries, their children, their doors. This wasn't weather. This was judgment. At first, it was only a few drops. They dotted the pale stone of the church roof and streaked down the arms of statues. But as the rain thickened, panic surged. Red puddles formed in the dust, staining garments, soaking into the earth. People screamed. Some fell to their knees. Others ran. By mid-morning, the village square had emptied. Abandoned bowls of grain, market stalls overturned, livestock bleating without their herders. Fear had taken hold. The priest rang the bell, calling for calm, but his hands trembled. His sermons had warned of divine punishment, of wrathful angels, of sins too heavy to go unnoticed. Now, his own words came back to haunt him. Villagers whispered of blasphemies committed, curses invited. The sins of the butcher who sold meat on holy days. The woman who had once refused the bishop's tithe. The child born with a sixth finger. In the chaos, some fled the village entirely, abandoning their homes as if fire had broken out. Whole families vanished into the hills, leaving doors swinging in the wind. Chickens pecked at blood-colored puddles. Horses refused to drink from the water trough. The rain continued until dusk. But was it truly blood? Centuries later, modern science would offer theories. One is red rain, a rare phenomenon caused by airborne spores or dust. Algae, such as Trentipolia, can be swept into the atmosphere during sandstorms and fall with rain, tinting it red. Other explanations cite Saharan dust mixing with storm clouds over Europe, transforming ordinary rain into something biblical in appearance. But to the people of 1251, there was no microscope, no biology, no wind patterns to chart, only the sight of a crimson sky and the creeping dread that their world was ending. Historical records from the region describe the event in vague but urgent language. Chroniclers called it the sky's affliction, and wrote of birds falling from the sky and dogs howling through the night. Some said the rain burned the skin. Others claimed it cured illness. Collecting it in jugs, they drank it, hoping it was a gift from God, not a curse. The church was split. Some priests called it a miracle. Others called it a test. Still others feared it was a punishment for heresies sweeping across Europe at the time. Inquisition fires were already beginning to light across Italy. Strange omens like this were fuel for the flames. We must remember, in 1251, Europe was tense. The wounds of the Fourth Crusade had not yet healed. Heresy and reform movements troubled the papacy. And peasant villages like Atri lived in constant tension between faith and fear. The sky was a messenger, and on that day, it spoke in red. What followed in Atri was darker still. After the rain stopped, a sickness spread. Not a plague, but a fever. Perhaps the spores had been real, carried on desert winds. Or perhaps it was simply the stress, the flight, the fear. But several villagers died within a week, shaking, sweating, mumbling of angels and knives. These deaths only deepened the terror. The rain had been a warning, they said. They hadn't listened. Now, the reckoning had begun. A council was called by the bishop in the nearest city. Delegates were sent to examine the event. The local priest, who had first rung the bell, was later removed from his post, some say for sowing hysteria, others say he had gone mad. He had taken to painting the rain in his chapel, murals of crimson skies and skeletal angels. He wrote in his margins that the rain tasted like iron and tears. Generations passed. The event became legend. Children were warned, "Do not sin, or the sky will bleed again." But the memory did not fade. Even centuries later, travelers in the region were shown the spot where it fell, told tales by shepherds whose ancestors still remembered that day. A day when the ordinary sky transformed into something terrible, not through lightning or war, but through color, through implication. In time, science would try to make sense of it. In 2001, red rain fell in Kerala, India. Modern-day scientists traced it to algae spores, just as theorized in the Italian case. But even now, some anomalies remain. Not all samples behave as spores should. Some react strangely under heat, under light. There are whispers among fringe scientists that what fell was not of this earth. Regardless of the truth, one thing is certain. For those villagers in 1251, there was no science, only fear. When the sky turned red, they believed, deeply and absolutely, that they were witnessing the end. And perhaps that's the most chilling part, because even now, centuries later, when the sky behaves in ways we can't explain, we too look up, and we wonder, what if it's not overreaction? What if the sky does remember? What if, once again, it begins to bleed? The famine of 1315, when neighbors turned on each other. It began with rain. Not a gentle spring shower or even a summer storm, but a relentless chilling downpour that started in May of 1315 and refused to stop. It soaked the fields of Europe day after day, month after month, until the soil turned to muck, the seeds rotted underground, and the crops that had sustained millions simply failed to grow. In the villages scattered across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries, the people waited. They hoped the skies would clear, the sun would return, and the fields would recover. But the rain only grew worse. Rivers burst their banks, grain stores molded, and when the harvest season arrived, there was nothing to gather. This was no isolated tragedy. It was the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315. A catastrophe so vast it swept across almost all of northern Europe and lasted for 3 brutal years. It is estimated that between 10% to 25% of the population perished, not from war or plague, but from hunger. And yet, the famine did something far worse than kill. It changed how people saw each other. It tore the bonds of community, of family, of faith. When hunger took hold, mercy fled. In some towns, people dug through forest floors in search of edible roots. Children were sent into the woods to collect bark, nettles, and anything that might be ground into a bitter paste. In the Alps, desperate villagers baked bread with sawdust and clay, poisoning themselves slowly just to feel full. In parts of Flanders, people hunted stray dogs and cats, and then their neighbors accused them of not sharing. But in the darkest corners of this famine, rumors surfaced, quiet at first, then louder. Entire families vanished, homes abandoned overnight, and the whispers began, not of wolves, but of men. There are accounts, fragmentary, disturbing, of neighbors turning on each other, a traveler arriving in a village and disappearing by morning, children left alone in cottages, taken in by those who offered food, never to be seen again. The line between survival and horror had blurred. Chroniclers of the time struggled to describe it. Monks who recorded the events used cautious language, afraid to commit to what they suspected. In England, the Annals of Dunstable noted, "Many who died of hunger, and others who were eaten." In Ireland, a priest wrote of a man who killed his own son to feed his family. Were these myths born of hysteria, or grim truths buried in the mud of desperation? And yet, the weather was only one part of the storm. The price of grain had already been rising due to population pressure. Europe was growing, fields were overworked, and livestock disease had weakened food systems. When the famine struck, the markets collapsed. Bread became a luxury. In some cities, A single loaf cost a laborer a full week's wages. Law and order began to crack. Theft of food was no longer a crime. It was expected. A man might be hanged not for stealing bread, but for hiding it. Lords raised taxes even during the worst of the famine, sending soldiers to seize what little grain remained. Peasants often resisted, and in many regions, open violence erupted. Famine bred anger, and anger turned into war. But perhaps most chilling was how long the suffering lasted. This was not a single year of poor harvest. It stretched on, through 1316 and into 1317. The rain did not stop. The ground remained soaked. Even when food could be grown again, it could not be distributed quickly enough. Roads had eroded. Horses and oxen had died. The networks that moved food from field to city had broken. By the end of it, a generation had been marked. Survivors were gaunt, their children stunted. Many villages never recovered. Entire parishes were left empty. Some towns built charnel houses, long stone buildings stacked with the bones of the dead, whose numbers overwhelmed the graveyards. Mass graves became the norm. When the Black Death arrived just 3 decades later, it encountered a continent still weakened by what had come before. The famine had already cracked the moral and physical foundations of society. It had taught people how to fear each other, and it had proven that when hunger arrives, civilization can unravel with terrifying speed. The Great Famine of 1315 is often forgotten, overshadowed by the dramatic horrors of later plagues and wars. But it was, in its way, just as catastrophic. It showed that nature could strike not with fire or flood alone, but with silence, with absence, with nothing to eat. And perhaps most terrifying of all, it showed that when that silence grows long enough, when hunger digs deep enough, the people you trust most, the ones next door, might stop seeing you as a neighbor and start seeing you as meat. The wolves came in the night. A true winter horror. Imagine a winter so cold that even the rivers freeze mid-flow, and the sky itself feels made of iron. It is the year 1321, deep in rural France. The harvest had failed, the livestock were thin, and the forests, once alive with birdsong, have fallen quiet beneath heavy snow. Villages are islands in a white sea. Firewood is scarce. Bread is bitter. People survive by habit, by prayer, by hope. But one night, hope runs dry. It begins with a sound, distant, mournful, a howl. At first, villagers assume it's the wind catching on the steeple, but the sound grows louder, more distinct. Not one wolf, many, dozens, some say more. The wolves have come down from the high hills, driven not just by hunger, but by starvation. The worst winter in memory has drained the forest of its prey. Deer have fallen. Hares have vanished. Even crows have fled. Only humans remain. In the village of Gavaudan, nestled among limestone cliffs and bare trees, the first attack comes suddenly. A child disappears from a snow-covered path between the church and his home. His father finds only a trail of blood and paw prints that vanish into a thicket. Then the screams begin, short, sharp, silenced. By dawn, 2 more are gone. The snow holds evidence, deep claw marks on wooden doors, scratch lines on window ledges. At night, the howling surrounds the village like a curse. Men with torches patrol the perimeters. They speak in hushed tones, gripping axes and pitchforks. But wolves are clever. They wait. They stalk. They test the edges of the human world and find its cracks. In Chalus, a schoolteacher and 5 children leave their tiny classroom to walk home. They never arrive. Hours later, a search party finds the children's trail. And then, nothing. No bodies. No sign of a struggle. Just an abandoned satchel and a single child's mitten, frozen stiff on a bed of pine needles. The rest is silence. This was not one isolated village. It happened again and again, in Dordogne, in Limoges, in mountain towns and farming communes. The wolves did not retreat after one kill. They returned night after night. They moved together. Packs of 10, 20, sometimes more. Witnesses described their eyes as glowing, their breath like smoke, their hunger bottomless. Panic gripped the countryside. Bells tolled warnings at dusk. Nobles organized hunting parties, but even mounted riders with crossbows failed to stem the tide. For every wolf slain, 3 more emerged. In the worst-hit areas, entire families abandoned their homes, fleeing to monasteries or larger towns. Some froze in the woods trying to escape. Others were caught on the roads, dragged screaming into the dark. Chroniclers of the time tried to make sense of it. Some wrote of werewolves, humans turned beast. Others blamed witches or divine punishment. One account claimed a woman was found alive inside a wolf's den, too terrified to speak. Another spoke of wolves walking on 2 legs, cloaked in snow, like ghosts. But modern historians believe the explanation may lie in nature itself. That winter, Europe experienced a brutal cold snap amid the early stages of what would later be called the Little Ice Age. Crops failed. Animal populations dropped. Rabies may have swept through wolf packs, making them more aggressive. And with human expansion into forest territory, the lines between wild and civilized blurred. Still, none of that explains the precision of the attacks. The silence with which wolves breached homes. The fact that some were not eaten, only taken. And not all bodies were ever found. That's what haunts the historical record, the absence. In Rouen, a merchant caravan was attacked within the city gates. In Paris, guards reportedly saw wolves dragging corpses from a plague cart. In one abbey, the monks rang the bells all night, praying to keep the beasts at bay. It worked for a time, but nothing was certain. When spring finally came, it brought no peace. The wolves vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Snow melted, trees budded, but the fear remained. Children had nightmares. Mothers locked doors long before sunset. Men refused to walk alone. Entire villages bore the emotional scars of that season, of the sounds, the disappearances, the long nights listening to the forests breathe. And over the centuries, the stories were passed down, not as fairy tales, but as warnings. In rural France, fireside tales speak of the winter the wolves came down, of families erased, of faces glimpsed in the dark between trees, and of the strange feeling that not all wolves walk on 4 legs. Even today, hikers in the forests of southwestern France report odd silences, strange tracks in fresh snow, the feeling of being watched, even in daylight. Perhaps the wolves are gone, perhaps not. Maybe they were just waiting for the next long, hard winter, a winter cold enough, desperate enough, to bring them back. Because in 1321 the woods stopped fearing man, and man learned what it meant to be prey. The wolves of 1321 became more than a memory. They became legend. Songs were sung of the blood moon nights. Carvings of wolves with human eyes were etched into stone chapels. Some villages erected shrines to appease them. Bones and meat left at forest edges long after the danger had passed. It was not out of tradition, but fear. A fear that hunger has a shape, and sometimes that shape returns. In every frost-laced gust and every cracked branch, the whispers endure. Not all terror is born from myth. Sometimes the truest horrors are the ones recorded in forgotten pages, when winter was deep and the night had teeth. The Lord's War became the peasant's death sentence. The year was 1363. In the rolling hills of Burgundy, France, dawn arrived not with peace, but with fire. Villagers stirred to the smell of smoke, not from hearths, but from thatched roofs set ablaze. Hooves trampled gardens, swords tore through haylofts, and by nightfall, a centuries-old village had been reduced to scorched earth, not for rebellion, not for crime, but for a feud between 2 feuding nobles who never once spoke to the peasants they destroyed. This wasn't war in the sense of kingdoms clashing. It was personal. a vendetta between lords, sparked by an insult at a wedding and fueled by pride, honor, and land rights. But like so many noble rivalries of the 14th century, the battlefield was not the marble courtrooms or dueling grounds, it was the villages in between. In this case, a small farming hamlet that owed allegiance to one of the lords found itself targeted by the other. The villagers had no choice, no defense, and no warning. These were not fighters. They were thatchers, shepherds, bakers, and midwives. Their lives revolved around crop cycles and prayers, not swords and banners. Yet when the rival nobles' men rode in, disguised at first as travelers, they lit the granary first. Then they slaughtered the oxen. Then they beat the village reeve, demanding he declare the village traitorous by association. When he refused, they left him hanging from the bell tower by morning. This real event, while almost forgotten in modern textbooks, was documented in monastic records and court complaints years later. The devastation was total. Of the 47 families that lived there, only 9 returned to rebuild in the decade that followed. Children disappeared. Livestock fled or were taken. The river that once fed the crops now ran black with ash and waste. This was not an act of war. It was a performance of dominance. The noble whose men attacked never faced judgment. His title protected him. He called it a punitive strike. Said the village had harbored enemies, but not a single weapon was found among the homes. No banners flown, no messengers received, just old women kneeling in the fields, just frightened boys shielding their siblings. In 1363, France was already fractured by the 100 Years' War. Kings battled for thrones, yet peasants paid the price. Famine had already thinned the population. The Black Death had scarred every town. And now, with the crown stretched thin, local nobles acted with near impunity, using private armies to settle disputes and burning villages like chess pieces off the board. We know of this tragedy not just from the monastery's logs, but from a surviving letter written by a scribe who escaped the blaze. He wrote, "We were not soldiers. We knew no flags. Our only fault was to belong to the land another man hated." His words echo the pain of thousands who lived during this era of feudal violence, caught between allegiances they never chose. The church tried to mediate, bishops wrote appeals, but justice came slowly, if ever. Compensation was promised by the noble's heir, but it was grain, delivered years later, when most survivors had moved away or died. The land remained salted by flame, its orchards blackened. The village well was poisoned with corpses. Travelers avoided the ruins, claiming it was haunted by ash and silence. What made this atrocity particularly cruel was that no one came to help, not the king, not the neighboring lords, not even the church until the embers had long cooled. The villagers, loyal and obedient, had sent their taxes, offered their sons for service, and prayed for peace, and in return, they received nothing but silence from the very powers they trusted to protect them. It was a betrayal written in fire. Nearby towns heard the rumors. Some sent scouts to see if it was true. They found scorched ground, empty cradles, bones scattered in the fields. Survivors who had fled into the forest lived like ghosts, feeding on bark and weeds, refusing to speak. One woman, they say, walked barefoot for days to reach a monastery. She collapsed at the gates and died with the words, "They burned even the cradle," on her lips. The noble who ordered the destruction gained nothing lasting. The lands he claimed were never truly his. They remained cursed in the minds of locals. Farmhands refused to till the earth. Traders avoided the roads. For years, strange crops grew wild where homes once stood. Twisted wheat, bitter apples. Some said the land itself remembered. In council, when the noble was asked about his actions, he responded coldly, "If I do not punish insult, I invite it." That was the code of the powerful then, honor not as virtue, but as weapon. His peers nodded, not in agreement, but in recognition, because they knew they could be next. And so no one held him accountable, It was a justice system built on fear, not fairness. The village was eventually mapped again by royal cartographers decades later, but only as a smudge on the page, a ruined cross, a note, no known survivors. It had no name in official records. The nobility erased what they broke, but the people remembered. And now, centuries later, that memory persists not in monuments, but in stories whispered through generations. The message is clear. History isn't only shaped by the kings who signed treaties, but by the peasants who suffered silently beneath their shadows. When war came to their doorstep, it didn't wear a crown. It wore armor, burned stables, and left behind silence. That is the true story of 1363. A feud between men of title turned into a tragedy for families with none. And while history may forget the village's name, we must not forget what happened there, because the lesson it left is eternal. When power clashes, it is the voiceless who bleed. A simple cut became a death sentence. It began with a single scratch. Not a wound from war, not a strike from a sword or an arrow, just a thorn, buried in a haystack, sharp and silent. In the summer of 1286, in a modest village nestled within the Holy Roman Empire, a farmer named Elias rose with the dawn. His calloused hands, weathered by years of toil, grasped the wooden pitchfork as he joined others in the fields for the hay harvest. The work was grueling, but it was life, and for Elias, it was routine, until a simple twist of his arm dragged a thorn across his forearm. He barely noticed. It stung, yes, and drew a thin line of blood, but there was no alarm. Men like Elias didn't pause for pain. They wiped the blood away with spit or mud and continued. To stop was weakness. And besides, it was just a scratch. But 3 days later, Elias couldn't move his arm. By the 5th day, he was delirious with fever, his flesh hot to the touch and darkening at the edges of the wound. Villagers who saw him whispered that he looked cursed, his skin turning a sickly hue, his sweat smelling of rot. The village healer had little to offer: a compress of crushed garlic and herbs, a poultice of moss, a whispered prayer. None of it stopped the red lines spreading from the wound like cracks through his veins. The truth was cruel and inescapable. Elias was dying, and he knew it. In today's world, his injury would have been rinsed under clean water, sterilized with antiseptic, wrapped in gauze, perhaps a tetanus shot, perhaps a course of antibiotics. But in the 13th century, the world had no such luxuries. Germ theory was centuries away. Infection had no name, only symptoms: heat, swelling, pain, decay, sepsis. Though unknown by name, its horrors were all too familiar in medieval life. A minor cut could swell until the entire limb pulsed with agony. Patients screamed, begged, fell into fits. Their minds drifted from fever into madness, then slipped into unconsciousness. Those who tried to save them, family, clergy, even midwives, knew that once the wound turned black or the skin crackled to the touch, death had already arrived. It was just waiting for the heart to stop. Elias, once a strong man, spent his final day writhing on a bed of straw. His wife wept quietly, clutching his hand as his breaths turned shallow, then slow, then ceased altogether. The priest performed a hurried last rite, and then they buried him, deep, outside the churchyard, out of fear the rot might somehow rise again. His children were told he'd been taken by God's will, but the truth was even more terrifying. Elias had been killed by the invisible. Historians estimate that in medieval Europe, as many as 1 in 3 deaths among laborers and villagers were caused not by famine or warfare, but by infection. A splinter from a cart axle, a bite from a rat, a tooth pulled with unwashed hands, each carried the seeds of death. Wounds were common. Clean water was not. Surgical tools, if they existed, were unsharpened, reused, and bloody from the last patient. Bloodletting was more likely than cleaning, and sterilization a fantasy. Those who dared perform surgeries, barber surgeons and battlefield medics, often wore blood-stained aprons like badges of honor, but their hands carried sickness. Some doctors even believed pus was a good sign, calling it laudable. They didn't yet know it was the body's last line of defense failing. And it wasn't just the poor. Monarchs and knights, priests and scholars, none were safe. Holy relics were applied to wounds. So were animal fats, ashes, and wine. Some worked by luck. Most did nothing. The real culprit, bacteria, would not be seen until Antonia van Leeuwenhoek peered through a microscope in the 17th century, centuries too late for Elias and millions like him. Until then, infection was a ghost, unseen, unstoppable, whispered about in prayers and lamented in graves. And so, when we hear of medieval dangers, of swords, wolves, famines, or fires, we must remember the quiet killers. The splinter, the blister, the bite. Because in a world without antiseptic, without antibiotics, even the gentlest wound was a loaded weapon. Even the morning's hay harvest could spell a man's doom. Elias's death was not unique. It was ordinary. That is what makes it horrifying. For every plague that swept through cities, 10,000 tiny plagues bloomed in wounds and festered in silence. Women died in childbirth not from the labor, but from the hands that delivered. Soldiers limped home from war victorious, only to rot in their sleep. Children scraped knees and were buried the same week. These were the deaths that left no legacy, just holes in families and echoes in forgotten fields. Today, when you clean a wound, when you reach for a bandage, when you take a pill, remember Elias. Remember that once, a man died screaming from a scratch that should have been nothing. That the progress we stand on is built not just from genius, but from centuries of nameless suffering. And that a simple cut was once a death sentence. The well was poisoned, and no one knew until it was too late. In the year 1390, in a quiet valley in what is now modern-day Germany, a village slept beneath the illusion of peace. Stone cottages lined the dusty roads, smoke drifted from chimneys, and the clanging of the blacksmith echoed across the fields. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where news traveled by foot and memory. But beneath this sense of stillness, something unseen had begun to poison everything. It started with the children. The first signs were small: a boy with a fever that wouldn't break, a girl too dizzy to stand, a toddler refusing to eat. At first, no one thought much of it. Illness was a part of medieval life. People lived beside it. But within days, the sickness grew. Mothers began collapsing while kneading dough. Fathers who had been working the fields one day were found trembling in bed the next. A priest vomited mid-sermon. A merchant's wife fell dead with foam at her mouth. Dozens fell ill in under a week, and no one could explain why. This was an age of fear and faith, where the line between the natural and the divine was blurry. To many, the cause was obvious. They had offended God. Someone had sinned. Someone had invited wrath into their midst. The villagers didn't look to their surroundings. They looked to each other. They blamed the old widow who lived near the woods, the one whose husband had died years ago and who muttered prayers in strange tones. They accused her of witchcraft. She was dragged to the square, beaten, and made to confess. Her tears did not stop them. She was locked in a cellar, but still, the sickness spread. It wasn't until a carpenter's apprentice, the son of a man who'd fallen ill, noticed something strange about the family's drinking water that the truth began to surface. The water tasted off, metallic, bitter, and the bucket they drew from the village well had a thin film over it. It shimmered strangely in the light. The village well had always been sacred. Dug by hand generations before, lined with stones blessed by priests, it was believed to be protected. People drank from it daily, used it to cook, to bathe, to clean wounds. Now it was killing them. Unbeknownst to them all, the real culprit lay just beyond the trees. A newly built tannery. erected months earlier by a traveling leather worker, had taken root near the top of a slope. Tanning, in the Middle Ages, was a foul, toxic process. Animal skins were soaked in lime and urine. They were then treated with tannins, chemicals leached from bark and soil, and rinsed in large vats. Wastewater was often discarded in shallow pits or dumped into nearby ground. In this case, that waste had seeped into the groundwater and trickled downhill until it reached the well. But no one knew that, not yet. They only knew that every day more of them grew ill, that the taste of their water had changed, that those who drank deeply died faster. By the time the village elders finally questioned the tannery's location, over 40 villagers had fallen sick, and 17 had died. A childless couple, both in their 20s, passed within the same hour. A monk, visiting from a nearby abbey, collapsed after one sip of soup. And still, most believed it was a curse. Some villagers begged for divine mercy. Others abandoned the village altogether, fleeing with only what they could carry. In their panic, many destroyed the old widow's house, convinced her curses still lingered in the beams. They smashed holy relics, hoping to stir God's attention. But no divine answer came. The leather worker was questioned and ultimately beaten after rumors spread that he had brought death in his barrels. He insisted he knew nothing, that he followed the practices taught by his own father, that he'd built where he was told. But few listened. It would be decades, centuries even, before science would understand the true effects of chemical runoff. Before it would become known that lime, tannins, and animal decay could contaminate water tables and spread lethal pathogens. But the signs had been there: a faint discoloration, a change in smell, a sickness that didn't pass through breath but through the body itself. The well was sealed. Rocks were thrown into its depths. Holy men were called to bless it, then condemn it. Eventually, a new one was dug, farther from the tannery, deeper and colder. But the memory remained. The village never fully recovered. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of the month the water betrayed them, when the one thing that had always given life turned against them. Years later, a record from a nearby monastery described the event as a pestilence without wind, without plague, without touch. The chronicler noted that death came not from man, but from the ground itself. We now know the truth, that the well had become a vessel of toxins, that ignorance and coincidence became fear and accusation. But for the villagers, it wasn't science that failed them. It was trust. Trust in their traditions, trust in their senses, and trust in the land. The most haunting part? They kept drinking long after the signs were there, because the water looked clear, because it was tradition, because no one believed the danger lived at the bottom of the well, until it was too late. The church bell that didn't ring, and everyone died. In the year 1272, nestled near the wild, contested borderlands between the Holy Roman Empire and warring principalities, lay a modest village, a place of worn soil, tight thatch roofs, and simpler hopes. It had no name anyone remembers today, no maps to mark its place, only the ruins beneath the earth and the silence that followed its end. This village, like many others in the medieval borderlands, relied on one thing above all for its survival: the bell. Not the church itself, though that stood proudly at the center, its timber frame sagging from age and rain. No, it was the bell, hung high in its crooked tower, that mattered most. Because when danger came, when riders galloped from beyond the woods or enemy scouts crept through the fog, it was the bell that cried out. Its echo rolled across the fields, stirred the cattle, woke the children, and sent every soul running, either to hide or to fight. It was, quite literally, the voice of survival. But in late autumn of that year, something happened. Quietly, without ceremony. The bell disappeared. No one knew who had taken it. No one saw the thieves. One morning, the tower was simply empty, ropes dangling, broken beams scattered like bones on the ground. Some said it had been stolen for its metal, to be melted down and sold. Others whispered it was a rival village, seeking to leave their enemies defenseless. Still, others believed it was a curse, a punishment from God for sins they could not name. They wrote letters to the Lord who governed the region, begging for a replacement. Messengers were sent, but war was stirring in the lowlands, and the local soldiers had little interest in a missing bell. Be watchful, the villagers were told. Light fires, post guards, protect yourselves. So they tried. A few men took to sleeping in the bell tower, though they had no bell to ring. Women kept lamps burning later. Dogs were let loose at night. But weeks passed, nothing happened, and a certain tired comfort returned. Harvest was ending. Bread was hard to come by. People were cold. Fear gave way to fatigue. The villagers went back to their beds, and that was when they came. Just before dawn, when the mist still clung to the frozen ground and the rooftops sparkled with frost, they rode in. 30 men on horses, silent, trained, without torches. Bandits, mercenaries, or soldiers from a distant conflict, no one knows for sure. They wore no flags. They offered no warnings. They entered like ghosts. The first to die was the old baker, who stepped outside to relieve himself before morning prayers. An arrow struck his chest. He didn't scream. Then the door to the granary was shattered. Men rushed inside, dragging out sacks of grain and anyone who stirred. Homes were set alight, but the smoke rose slowly in the cold, going unnoticed by those still asleep. There was no alarm, no bell. The guards in the tower had nodded off hours earlier. 2 boys, barely old enough to hold a sword. They were found hours later, throats slit, the blood frozen to the beams. By the time the village stirred, it was already too late. Doors were broken. Fires spread unchecked. Screams echoed from barns and alleyways, but they were swallowed by the woods, unheard by any allies. The people ran, but where? Into the forest, where the cold would finish what the invaders started, or into the church, where a bell-less tower stood mute above the chaos. Some hid in cellars, others fought, but most were caught still rubbing sleep from their eyes, unsure if it was a dream or if they were already dead. When it was over, the sun had just begun to rise, the frost had melted into the blood. Crows had started to gather on the blackened rooftops, and the village, once small but alive, now stood silent. Those who discovered it days later, soldiers from a neighboring province, found only smoldering ruins and unburied bodies. The church was untouched, its door open, as if waiting for the congregation to return, but no one ever did. And in the tower above, the rope still hung where the bell once was, swinging gently in the morning wind, pointless, silent. That is the tragedy of the bell that didn't ring. The tragedy of a village not destroyed by fire or sword alone, but by silence. And if you listen closely, the story remains. A warning not written in books, but whispered in superstition. Always guard your bell, because when danger comes and the bell is gone, no one will wake up in time. The day the river took the children. Imagine a quiet Welsh valley in the year 1303. Green hills cradle a small village where life flows gently like the river beside it. That river, broad, brown, and usually calm, cuts through the landscape like a winding ribbon of breath. The village depends on it. Women gather water at its edge. Men fish for trout and salmon. Children laugh and play along the muddy banks, their feet wet, their hands full of river stones and reeds. It is market day. The square is loud with merchants, goats, and carts, unaware. The morning begins with clear skies, but far away, high in the mountains, a storm brews, unseen and unheard by those below. In those days, there were no warnings, no forecasts, no signs save the shift in the wind. The rain begins suddenly. A wall of water rushes through mountain channels, gathering speed and power. By the time it reaches the valley, it is not a river, it is a monster. What strikes the village is a flash flood, a roaring wall of debris, boulders, tree trunks, and violent foam. It slams into the lower fields first, tearing fences from the earth. Livestock vanish in seconds. The village bell rings once, then is silenced by the crash. People scream, drop baskets, run. But not everyone hears it in time. Along the banks, children were playing, 5, maybe 6, all under the age of 10. They had no chance. Witnesses later say the water came like a stampede, sudden, deafening. The children vanished in moments, pulled beneath the surface. No shouts, no time to run. Only the river, rising, churning, swallowing. Parents waded in after them, screaming their names. But the current was merciless. It dragged everything: trees, stones, wagons, bodies. By the time the water receded, hours later, there was no sign of the children, no footprints, no clothing, just silence. Grief settled over the village like mist. Mothers stood barefoot at the river's edge for days, hoping. Fathers wandered the banks for miles, searching upstream and down, eyes bloodshot from crying and exhaustion. But the children were gone. In the days that followed, a strange thing happened. Some claimed to hear laughter by the water at night. Others said they saw small footprints appear in the silt, only to be washed away moments later. Whether ghost stories or grief, no one could say. But candles were left near the riverbanks, tiny toys placed beneath stones, songs were whispered to the water. The event passed into legend. No royal scribe recorded it. No monument was raised. But the villagers remembered. They told the story each year on the anniversary. They warned their own children, never go too close because the river remembers. And once, it took 5 names and never gave them back. Some historians believe the storm that caused the flood was part of a larger weather shift, a precursor to the cooler centuries of the Little Ice Age. Others point to deforestation and poor hillside drainage, noting that even small rivers can become deadly when mountain slopes are stripped bare. But no theory can explain the silence that followed, or the way an entire valley seemed to grieve, not just the people, but the air itself. In nearby villages, word spread slowly. Messengers on horseback arrived days later to find a community changed. They spoke to villagers who could barely speak in return. People hollow-eyed, quiet, moving as if underwater. The market square, once lively, stood empty. The chapel held candles burning day and night. And the river? It flowed calmly, as though nothing had happened. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. The villagers began to treat the river not as a resource, but as a force. Offerings were made, prayers whispered into its current. Children were told old Celtic names for it, names of spirits and deities once believed forgotten. Ancient stories returned, of river gods that demanded sacrifice, of waters that punished pride. Whether out of fear or reverence, the villagers no longer walked its banks without permission. Decades later, when another flood threatened the valley, elders recalled 1303, they told younger generations not to build too close, and when new settlements rose, they were placed on higher ground, out of respect or fear, or both. The original village was left to fade beneath ivy and ash, but even as memory dimmed, the land kept the record. Farmers unearthed bits of pottery near the banks. A stone carving of a child's face, worn down by centuries of rain, was found embedded in a hillside. Some said it was coincidence. Others were not so sure. By the 1600s, the story became folktale, a cautionary tale told beside fires. Of the day laughter stopped, of the 5 children who vanished, of the river that didn't forgive. Versions grew more elaborate. In some, the children were taken because they mocked a holy day. In others, they were lured by singing from beneath the water. Each version changed, but one detail remained the same. No bodies were ever found. In modern times, historians searching old ecclesiastical records found a single mention of a great storm in the region during Lent of that year. The note is brief, almost dismissive. Much water did fall, and great sorrow came to the Vale of Stone. That Vale of Stone, they now believe, referred to the village lost to the flood. Today, hikers pass through the region, unaware of what lies beneath their boots. The river still cuts its path through the valley, deceptively calm. But local guides pause before crossing its narrow wooden bridge. Some say the birds go quiet near the bend where the children once played, and sometimes, when the mist is low and the rain begins to fall, visitors hear something beneath the sound of water. Not voices, not screams, just laughter, thin, distant, and impossible. The Day the River Took the Children is a story that lives not in books, but in the landscape, in the strange stillness of wet soil, in the way the river seems to watch, and in the truth that even after 7 centuries, water does not forget. The doctor was a fraud, a village poisoned by cure. The year was 1359, and fear hung heavy over the village of Saint Brice. Disease had become a silent specter in post-plague Europe, and when a stranger arrived wearing a long black coat and wide-brimmed hat, he was not feared, but welcomed. He called himself a doctor. He claimed to have studied in Padua and traveled through Spain, and more importantly, he carried a miracle tonic, bottled in dark glass, sealed with wax, and sold with solemn promises. The villagers gathered in the square as he spoke of purification, of strength against the lingering fevers that still haunted every household since the Black Death's shadow. He handed out free samples to the poorest families. He sold vials to the rest for a few copper coins. His hands were gentle, his voice calm, and his words brought hope. For the first time in months, people believed they might be safe. By nightfall, the first children began to vomit. The baker's wife collapsed in her oven room. The old priest was found gasping by his altar. At first, no one connected the dots. They blamed spoiled meat, bad air, divine wrath. But when a dozen fell ill, all of whom had taken the so-called tonic, panic set in. By sunrise, the doctor was gone. His wagon, his satchels, even the hoofprints of his horse, vanished. The villagers searched every road, sent riders to nearby towns, but no trace remained. The bottles, however, remained, and they were all the same. Thick sediment clinging to the bottom, a bitter odor leaking from the wax. When one brave villager tasted it, he fell ill within hours. That man survived, barely. Many others did not. This was not just a crime, it was a massacre wrapped in deception. We know of this event from parish death records and a preserved letter written by a monk who came days later to bury the dead. He wrote, "They drank what they thought was life, and it hollowed them from within." He counted 27 fresh graves in a single week. What was in the tonic? We'll never know for certain. But herbalists later suggested a combination of spoiled alcohol, bitterroot, and possibly mercury, common in some medieval remedies, deadly in improper doses. The fraud likely used just enough familiar ingredients to mimic medicine, then padded the rest with toxic filler to make it stretch further. More profit, more death. But why? That remains the most chilling question. Was he a charlatan chasing gold, a sadist cloaked in medical guise, or worse, a man who once studied medicine and then lost faith, turning his knowledge into a weapon? No one ever found him. No one ever saw him again. And the village, once lively, became a place of mourning. Families burned the remaining vials. They cleansed homes with salt and prayer. The church declared a day of silence, but the damage had already been done, not just to the bodies, but to the soul of the village. From that day forward, no traveling healer was ever trusted again. People feared help more than illness, and that fear lasted for generations. The event became legend, a cautionary tale passed through whispers. Children were warned, never trust the smiling stranger, and when future sickness came, many chose to endure rather than risk another false cure. That mistrust, born from one man's deception, shaped generations of skepticism. What makes this story even more haunting is that 1359 was already a time of desperate faith. The Black Death had torn through Europe just a decade earlier. Millions were dead, whole towns erased. So when hope knocked on the door, people opened it wide, even if death wore a disguise. And the disguise worked because it mimicked everything familiar: robes, tonics, promises of safety. This so-called doctor didn't arrive with chains or weapons. He came with kind eyes and gentle words. But he carried a slow dagger, one that carved through the weak and trusting. The church could offer no justice. There were no courts, no trials. The man had no name. He left behind no trace, only questions. How many villages had he visited before? How many after? Was St. Brice the first, or just one of many? We'll never know. But for the people of that village, the lesson was clear. Healing can be a weapon when wielded by the wrong hands. Even the local magistrate, an aging man named Belur, tried to write to the bishopric for help, but there was no response. Too many villages were sending cries for aid. Too many outbreaks, too many tragedies. One report in a nearby town claimed that a similar man had passed through weeks earlier, offering golden elixirs that turned black when uncorked. That town had closed its gates and driven him off with stones. St. Brice had welcomed him. The memory of the event did not fade. Decades later, a chronicler referenced the poisoner in black during a lecture on the failures of early medicine. He remarked that one man's ambition, or malice, could unravel generations of trust in healing. The case was even cited in a 15th century edict warning about unauthorized healers selling unproven concoctions to rural communities. But for St. Brice, those words came far too late. In the years that followed, survivors showed signs of lasting harm. Children who drank the tonic developed tremors. One boy, the monk recorded, never spoke again. A girl lost all her teeth before the age of 10. The people had not just suffered a single tragedy, they had been altered. The bodies bore witness even as memory dulled. And so, St. Brice faded from maps, but not from stories. It became a caution to future doctors and a symbol in early medical ethics. Healers were reminded that their power was sacred, and that betrayal of trust was not just sin, but heresy. In modern times, this event is rarely discussed. It doesn't feature in grand histories, but in the quiet corners of medieval memory, it remains a scar. Because what happened in 1359 wasn't just a poisoning, it was a betrayal of hope, a wound deeper than any plague, because it came from the very thing meant to save. A man arrived, offering healing. By morning, he was gone, and the village was dying. That is the story of the doctor who lied, and the village that paid in blood. The morning of the witch trials. It was just after sunrise when the town square began to stir. The bells did not ring for mass that morning. Instead, they rang for judgment. In the year 1432, in a small village nestled along the edge of the Black Forest, 4 women, Margreta, Ilsa, Anka, and Lene, were dragged from their homes, their arms bound, their names already decided in whispers long before the council convened. The harvest had failed. The barley had blackened in the field, the well ran foul, and 3 infants had died of fever. Someone had to be blamed, and someone always was. They were not strangers. They were midwives, widows, healers, keepers of old recipes and older stories. They were known to be kind, but quiet, and quiet women were dangerous. The council's decision had been made before the accused even stood trial. No evidence was required, only suspicion, reinforced by fear. Margreta had spoken to the wind, they said. Anka had been seen gathering herbs by moonlight. Ilsa had a cat that never left her side. And Lene had laughed once when the mayor's son fell ill. That was enough. That was more than enough. They were taken to the town hall and paraded in front of their neighbors, some of whom had shared their bread the week before. But now, those same neighbors averted their eyes, as if guilt might leap from glance to flesh. The accusations were read aloud in trembling tones: consorting with demons, spoiling the crops, conjuring storms. None of it had to be real. It only had to feel real. The inquisitor sent from a neighboring city arrived 2 days prior. carrying scrolls and an iron cross, eyes sharpened by doctrine. His presence alone signaled what was to come. He did not ask if the women were guilty. He asked if they had repented, because in these trials, repentance was proof. To confess was to confirm the fear, and to deny was to resist divine order. Either way, the fire waited. Torture was used not to uncover truth, but to shape it. Lena's hands were crushed in a press until she whispered what they wanted. Anka was hung by her wrists until her shoulders dislocated and her voice cracked into a scream. Ilsa, nearly 70, was stripped and forced to walk barefoot across frozen stones. And Margreta, gentle, frail Margreta, was locked in darkness and told the others had already named her. Alone, starved, and cold, she broke. She confessed to flying on the back of a demon through clouds made of ash. She invented names of spirits. She gave them exactly what they wanted, and that made it real. The morning of the executions, the square was filled with smoke even before the fires were lit. 4 wooden stakes stood in the center, bound with ropes and wreaths of dry pine. The villagers gathered in silence, some out of duty, others curiosity. A few wept quietly, not for the accused, but for the sickness growing inside them, the shame they dared not speak. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see. The priest spoke of purity, of cleansing, of evil being burned from the body of the town. No one spoke of the harvest. No one spoke of the cold. Each woman was given a chance to confess once more. Each refused. Lene looked to the sky as the flames climbed her skirt. Anka sang. Ilsa, defiant to the last, cursed the mayor by name, and Margreta cried for her daughter to be taken away before she saw her mother die. The air filled with crackling wood, ash, and screams. When it was over, the priest declared the village saved. The inquisitor packed his scrolls. The ashes were swept into the wind, and life continued. But nothing truly returned to normal. The harvest failed again the next year. Another child died. The well still soured, yet no one spoke of witches, not because they no longer believed, but because belief had already claimed what it wanted. The fire had been fed, and those who watched that morning had learned that silence was safer than compassion. What happened in that village was not an anomaly. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, more than 50,000 people, mostly women, were executed across Europe for witchcraft. Often, these women were healers, midwives, widows, those who held knowledge outside the church or power without permission. They were targeted not for what they had done, but for who they were. And the tools of their condemnation were fear, desperation, and authority, wielded without mercy. Many of their names are lost, their stories buried beneath layers of denial and rewritten faith. But some records remain. Testimonies carved by trembling hands, church logs, chronicles by monks who both condemned and pitied. From those fragments, we learn what fire tried to erase, that hysteria is never sudden. It is built one fear at a time, that justice without evidence becomes vengeance in robes, that the line between survival and savagery is thin and easily crossed when the harvest fails. Today, their names, Margreta, Ilsa, Anka, Lene, do not appear in grand history books. They left behind no monuments, but in a quiet field somewhere near the forest's edge, wildflowers bloom in strange patterns, and the wind hums in the pines as if remembering, as if history itself still grieves. And perhaps it should. Because the morning of the witch trials wasn't just one village's tragedy, it was the moment fear learned to wear a crown, and silence learned to bow. The tax that took their winter bread. In the winter of 1297, the cold did not arrive alone. It came with parchment, sealed with wax, written in Latin, and carried by men in armor. The royal tax decree spread across the kingdom like frost, quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere. It demanded what every peasant feared losing most: grain, wheat, barley, oats, whatever could be milled, stored, and eaten. The order was simple. Every household must surrender a portion of their stores for the crown's use. No exemptions, no mercy. But the timing was cruel. The harvest that year had been lean, the summer unusually dry. Crops had withered early in the fields. Rats had found their way into the barns. Families had counted each loaf, each sack of grain, each seed they dared not eat for fear of losing the next year's yield. It was barely enough to make it through the long winter that loomed ahead. And then the tax came. Collectors, escorted by soldiers, moved from village to village with wagons and ledgers. They took what was owed and more. Some offered coins as substitute, but few had any. So grain was taken, measured by hand, shoveled by force. Bread dough still rising on hearths was confiscated. Ovens were emptied, granaries unlocked. Fields that had already been reaped were scoured again. Even seed grain, meant for spring planting, was not spared. In many cases, the villagers resisted, but resistance was dangerous. One man in Devonshire refused to open his barn. His neighbors watched as he was beaten unconscious and left in the snow. In a village near York, an elderly widow clutched her last bag of rye, begging the guards to let her keep it for her grandchildren. They took it anyway. By December, the noble carts rolled through the icy roads, groaning under the weight of grain taken from the mouths of the poor. It was bound for castles, for manor feasts, for military garrisons preparing for the Scottish campaigns. Some say the grain never reached the front lines. That much of it ended up in the storerooms of minor lords and corrupt stewards. Meanwhile, in the villages, fires burned low. Bellies grew hollow. Winter tightened its grip. Without grain, bread disappeared first. Porridge became thinner. Stews stretched with roots and herbs. Salted meat, once a luxury, vanished entirely. Children stopped playing. They slept most of the day, their bodies conserving energy. Mothers told stories while boiling pots of water, hoping to trick their families into feeling full. Some chewed leather scraps soaked in broth, others ground acorns into bitter meal. And still, the snow kept falling. By late January, hunger turned deadly. Records from local parishes, though sparse, tell grim tales. Entire families perished in a single week. In some hamlets, the dead were stacked in frozen barns, awaiting spring thaws for proper burial. A priest from Lincolnshire wrote that his church bells rang more that month than they had in the previous year combined. The tax collectors had moved on by then. Their job was done, but the consequences remained. In some regions, peasants turned on each other, accusing neighbors of hiding grain, hoarding food, or collaborating with officials. Or trust unraveled like old rope. Others blamed God. Fasts turned into desperate prayers. Flagellants walked barefoot through the snow, whipping their backs raw in hopes of divine forgiveness. Some believed the famine was punishment for hidden sin. Others cursed the king's name under their breath, terrified but bitter. What made this tax so devastating wasn't only its weight, it was its timing. Just before winter, when grain meant survival, when every seed was counted, the crown asked for a sacrifice it knew the people couldn't afford. It wasn't simply taxation. It was extraction of life, of dignity, of hope. Centuries later, this event faded into the margins of royal records. It was just another decree, another entry in a ledger. But to those who lived it, to the mothers who watched their children wither, to the men who buried neighbors with frozen hands, to the priests who blessed the dead before collapsing themselves, it was a scar that never healed. Historians today recognize the winter of 1297 as one of the cruelest examples of feudal indifference, a moment when policy and power came before humanity, when the needs of war and court overshadowed the desperate pleas of the land's most vulnerable. The tragedy was not just in what was taken, it was in what was left behind. Empty barns, silent fields, and a winter without bread. The village that forgot the feast day and paid the price. In 1208, in the hills of southern France, Surrounded by olive groves and dry, wind-blown fields, stood a small farming village. It was the kind of place easy to miss, too poor for nobility, too remote for travelers, too humble for history. But one mistake would carve its name into whispered legend, a mistake not of violence or crime, but of forgetfulness. They forgot the feast day. The feast of St. Bertrand, protector of the harvest, had been celebrated in the region for generations, a day of rest, a day of candles, bells, and sacred processions, a day when no scythe should swing, no grain be cut, and no hand touch the soil. It was not optional, it was divine law. But that year, the rains had been late. The fields, once golden, were stubborn. Crops threatened to spoil if they weren't harvested fast. Hunger had loomed for weeks. So the villagers made a choice. They worked. The morning of the feast, while the church bell rang across the valley, the people stayed in the fields. No incense, no chanting, just the rhythmic sweep of sickles. From the hilltop monastery, the local bishop watched, alone, offended, and furious. He sent a letter, not to explain, but to condemn. He declared their action a violation not just of church law, but of divine order. He accused them of pride, of heresy, of abandoning the saints who guarded their land. And then he did something far more dangerous. He declared them cursed. Under medieval law, the church held more than spiritual power. It controlled food, alms, water rights, even seed grain during lean seasons. If the church withdrew its support, a village could starve. And that's exactly what happened next. The following year, a drought arrived. The sun stayed high and unblinking. Rivers thinned to dirty threads. Wells turned bitter. The crops withered before they could be harvested. But when the villagers begged the bishop for help, he denied them. No blessings, no grain, no forgiveness. Nearby towns received alms and holy relief. Traveling monks brought water, oil, even livestock to those who kept the faith. But to the village on the hill, nothing came. When the famine deepened, they offered penance, public flagellation, a reconstructed altar to St. Bertrand dressed in new cloth, a procession of barefoot children through thorns. But the bishop held firm. The curse would remain, he said, until the land itself confessed. People began to die. At first, it was the old, then the children, then those who refused to leave the land, convinced the saint would forgive them eventually. But faith, once shaken, can splinter. Factions formed. Some blamed the bishop. Others said it was truly God's wrath. A few even turned away from the church altogether, a dangerous decision in an age when excommunication was often a death sentence in itself. The local clergy eventually removed themselves entirely. No priest would serve the altar of a cursed village. No sacraments were given. No last rites. Even the church bell was taken down, its silence a mark of divine abandonment. Years passed, the drought lifted, but the curse never truly faded. Trade routes shifted away. Children grew up without learning the saint's name, and the village became a ghost, shunned by neighboring towns, rarely visited except by the desperate. It was only decades later, after the bishop had died, that the church quietly reinstated the village into its good graces. A young priest arrived to reclaim the chapel, but by then few remained to welcome him. The population had withered. The fields had gone fallow. The feast of St. Bertrand was never celebrated there again. The story survives only in fragments, in dusty local archives, in the margins of a bishop's angry letter, in rumors passed down from grandmother to grandchild. But it speaks to something larger. In the medieval world, to forget a feast was not just forgetfulness, it was betrayal. And betrayal, even one born from hunger, was punished not by man, but by God's silent instruments, drought, famine, and the cold turning away of those meant to save you. In the end, it wasn't the sun that burned them. It was the silence from the steeple above, a bell that never rang, a saint who never returned, and a people who paid with everything for a single day of work. The day the blacksmith's forge exploded. Imagine the scent of scorched iron and wood smoke drifting through the narrow alleys of a medieval village. The year is 1279, and the village of Elwick stands nestled between fields and forest, its wooden homes clustered around a central square. At the heart of it all is the forge. More than a workplace, it is the village's pulse. The blacksmith is both craftsman and keeper of the flame. He makes horseshoes, plowheads, nails, armor. His hammer rings like a bell of life, until the day it all turns to fire. It began like any other morning. The forge was stoked early, bellows groaning as coal turned white hot. The blacksmith, a man known for his strength and good humor, worked alongside his two sons, shaping red metal into tools. Sparks flew harmlessly at first, but something went wrong. Perhaps a flaw in the chimney, perhaps an ember caught in dry thatch, or perhaps the coal burned too long, too hot. Witnesses would later say the heat was strange that day, intense, thick, and choking even from a distance. Some claim to hear a sound like a scream rising from the forge before it burst. In seconds, the forge exploded outward in a torrent of flame and shattered timber. The heat ignited nearby straw roofs like paper. A firestorm raced from house to house, leaping across narrow lanes with terrifying speed. Children screamed, animals bolted. The blacksmith and his family never escaped. Their bodies were never fully recovered, consumed in the instant of ignition. Villagers grabbed buckets, blankets, anything. But water was scarce, and panic spread faster than the flames. In under 15 minutes, half the village was ash. Only stone walls and scorched iron remained. Smoke blackened the sky. Survivors wept amid the ruins, calling out names that would never be answered. The chapel bell melted. Tools fused into molten clumps. The air itself seemed to burn. What made this fire so devastating wasn't just the forge, it was how tightly built the village was, how dependent it had become on one powerful fire. In a time before safety valves or pressure checks, a forge was a dragon in chains, and on that day, the chains failed. In the weeks that followed, survivors tried to rebuild, but the scars were deep. The village had lost not just its blacksmith, but its center. Every tool, every nail, every plowshare had come from that forge. With it gone, so was the means to shape survival. Winter was approaching. Roofs had been lost. Livestock, frightened and scattered, never returned, and many of the hands needed to rebuild now lay beneath blackened soil. Neighboring villages sent aid, barley, axes, blankets. But fear came too. Whispers that Elwick was cursed began to spread. That fire like that does not come without reason. Some claimed they saw faces in the smoke, or heard the blacksmith's hammer still ringing through the night, echoing from the ruins. Fearful pilgrims left offerings, horseshoes, knives, coins, by the scorched stones, begging the fire not to visit their homes next. And while time dulled the memories for many, others never let go. The blacksmith's surviving daughter, only 7 at the time, rescued from her schoolhouse, never spoke another word. She grew up silent, often found kneeling at the edge of the ruins, tracing the ashes with her fingers. Years later, an inspection of the forge remains revealed fused stone and signs of rapid overpressure. A chimney collapse may have trapped gases, allowing heat and smoke to build until it reached explosive force. Today, we'd call it a thermal runaway, a feedback loop of heat and compression with deadly consequence. But in 1279, it was alchemy gone wrong, a fire that seemed to choose its victims. The story of Elwick's forge became a regional warning. Apprentice blacksmiths were made to memorize it. Masters would pause before lighting coals to recite lines passed down through generations. Respect the flame or be devoured. Some blacksmiths carved protective runes into the beams above their hearths. Others stopped working during storms or holy days, fearing the same fate. Even today, archaeological digs in the area occasionally uncover scorched iron tools buried deep in dark soil. Most have melted edges, warped by heat beyond normal use. And in the village museum miles away, A lump of fused iron rests in a glass case, marked simply Elwick, 1279. There's a strange reverence around the story, perhaps because it wasn't caused by invasion, politics, or plague, but by man's own creation. Fire, the same force that shaped the world, turned against its master, and it did so without warning, without mercy. Visitors to the field where Elwick once stood report uneasy feelings. Animals avoid it. Nothing grows quite right there. And on some nights, when the sky is clear and the wind is still, locals swear they can see flickers of orange in the distance. Not campfire, not lightning, just flame, where none should be. The day the blacksmith's forge exploded isn't just a tale of fire. It's a tale of how close medieval life lived to the edge, how every convenience carried a shadow, and how the same fire that warmed and fed could, in a breath, erase everything. Because in Elwick, fire didn't escape. It was released, and once it woke, it didn't stop until the village was silent. The night's hunt that left the village starving. In the winter of 1314, the wind over northern France carried not just cold, but hunger. Snow dusted the fields of a small village nestled beside the lord's estate. The people there were used to hardship, harvests were thin, and wood had to be gathered from distant forests. But they endured, carefully storing grain, rationing apples, and fattening a few pigs for the bitter months ahead. Every winter was a battle. This one, however, would become a memory etched in frost and famine, not by storm, but by steel-clad riders. It began with the horns. The blast rang through the valley at dawn, signaling a noble hunt. Lord Renaud, clad in armor trimmed with fur, rode out with a dozen knights, dozens more squires, and a pack of barking hounds. The lord sought boar and venison, symbols of prestige, of wealth, of dominion. But the forest beyond his estate had been too thoroughly hunted, so he turned toward the village commons, where wild game still roamed. He had no permission. He gave no warning. The hunt was his by right, or so he believed. They trampled through the barley fields, frozen but still holding the last shoots of green. They shattered fences, broke into livestock pens, and chased deer through vegetable patches. Pigs scattered. Chickens squawked into the air, never to return. The village reeve, a humble man named Gilles, approached the riders on foot. He begged, explained that these stores were the community's survival. Lord Renaud never dismounted. He merely laughed, waved him off, and claimed the right of the land. By the end of the day, the fields were ruined. 30 rabbits and 4 deer were taken. So were 6 of the village's last pigs and the ox used to pull the millstone. That night, Lord Renaud dined in his great hall on fresh venison stew, black bread, and honeyed wine. Meanwhile, the villagers gathered in the cold, speaking in hushed voices as children cried from hunger. This event, though small in the eyes of history, was recorded in a monastery ledger 2 towns away. A monk named Etienne visited that spring to deliver tithes and found emaciated families and empty granaries. He wrote, "Never have I seen such thin joy. They speak not of weather or God, but only of food they once had." And he noted something else, anger, the kind that builds slowly beneath skin and silence. In 1314, nobles were not merely landowners, they were the law. A village's crops were technically the lord's property, but custom dictated protection, not destruction. Lords were expected to oversee justice, maintain peace, and ensure their subjects could survive. But what Renaud did was not just greedy, it was betrayal. The villagers had no recourse. They could not afford appeal. Traveling to court required time, money, and noble support they did not possess, so they suffered in place. That winter, 3 children died of starvation. One mother went mad and tried to eat the leather from her shoe. The old miller was buried in a shallow grave, too frail to outlast the season. The spring harvest came late and sparse, and the village never truly recovered. What's more tragic is that Renaud likely never thought twice. To him, it was a hunt, an indulgence to impress guests. But to the villagers, it was a catastrophe, a moment when the line between protector and predator disappeared. And this happened more than once. Across Europe, countless villages faced similar intrusions. Lords seized crops, armies marched through fields. The very people meant to defend the land were often those who broke it. In modern times, these acts are called microhistories, small moments with devastating human impact. They rarely make it into textbooks, but they are the lifeblood of medieval truth. History is not only shaped by battles and kings, but by stolen pigs and trampled wheat, by the nobility's feast and the peasant's hunger. That spring, as rain softened the ruined fields, villagers tried to sow what little they had. Seed grain borrowed from a neighboring town arrived too late for proper planting. Without oxen, they pulled plows by hand. The new crop was weak, and disease spread easily through undernourished children and the elderly. One family was found sharing boiled bark and moss, sustaining themselves on desperation. The graveyard swelled with simple stones, unmarked but remembered. Gilles, the reeve who had once pleaded with Lord Renaud, was never the same. He stopped speaking in town meetings. He wandered the edges of the forest each evening, staring at where the hunt had begun. Some say he buried bread loaves in the ground to preserve them, but found only mold and tears when he returned. His wife said he died not of sickness, but of shame. When Etienne returned a year later, he barely recognized the place. Children who had once laughed in the fields were now thin and silent. The chapel stood unlit. Candles had long since melted down and not been replaced. Hope, he wrote, had moved on. And Lord Renaud, he hosted another hunt. This time, he brought more guests. He was praised in court circles for his hospitality and rustic charm. He even received a gift from a local baron, a new falcon, trained to kill in flight. Not a word was ever spoken of the starving village he had gutted, but records like Etienne's survived, and with them the truth. While Renaud's lineage vanished within a few generations, the story of the winter hunt endured in whispered folk songs and bitter prayers. It is said that during harsh winters, villagers in the region would still mutter, "Let not the night ride this way," a curse, a warning, and a memory. Because what happened in 1314 wasn't just about food. It was about power used without care, about joy purchased with someone else's misery. And that is why the night's hunt remains one of the cruelest kinds of history. Not one of war, but of waste. Not of swords, but of stolen suppers. Even today, it stands as a reminder, the greatest cruelty often hides behind celebration, and the hunger left behind tells a truth no feast can silence. The earth shook, and the village split. Imagine the dawn breaking over a rolling expanse of fields and forests, the mist still clinging to the low hills. It is the spring of 1382 in a quiet hamlet tucked between two rocky ridges in what is now southwestern Germany. Stone wells stand at the center of the village, their circular mouths bordered by centuries-worn cobblestones. Houses of timber and wattle lean against one another, thatched roofs shaded by ancient oaks. This is home to 30 families, farmers and shepherds bound by kinship and faith, and by the land itself. Without warning, the ground shivered. At first, only a tremor, a gentle undulation beneath the soles of leather shoes, so slight that some elderly villagers blamed wind rattling through the tree roots. Then came the roar, a deep, rumbling sound, like a mountain collapsing, echoing in every bone. The stone wells cracked with a thunderous snap, fissures spidering across the masonry. Walls sighed and buckled. Roof beams groaned, then surrendered. Dogs barked, panicked, and children wailed. In an instant, the village had become a broken cradle. When the dust settled, 4 homes lay in ruins. Timber frames splintered. Clay walls fell like pudding. 2 of the stone wells were fractured beyond repair, water muddy with earth. But worse than the wreckage was the silence that followed. Survivors stumbled through shattered doorways, clutching their bleeding hands, calling names into the rubble. Neighbors gathered in the square, eyes wide with shock, counting the living and the dead. 3 children lay beneath collapsed beams, their mothers kneeling beside them in grief. In a normal year, the local lord might have dispatched men-at-arms or masons to help. He might have provided stone blocks or levied fewer taxes. Yet in 1382, Europe was riven by feudal strife, and the specter of plague still haunted fresh graves. Nobles were distant, preoccupied by battles and revenues. Relief would not come. The villagers were alone, their fate entrusted to their own strength and solidarity. By mid-morning, they gathered at the ruins of the largest house, a 2-story dwelling whose upper floor had collapsed into the ground floor, trapping a family of 6. Father Ulrich, a burly man whose cartwheels had splintered under him, strapped a leather harness to his chest and began hauling ruined beams away with the help of 3 young men. They worked with their bare hands, splinters cutting their palms, sweat mingling with dirt. Others waded into the fractured wells, forming human chains to fetch water in buckets, risking collapse as stones rained down around them. The village healer, a woman named Elizabeth, leaned close to the dust-choked earth, checking for sounds of breathing beneath the rubble. She had no tools beyond a wooden staff and a handful of salves, but compassion guided her hands as she cleared debris. At her side strode a teenage boy, delivering cups of spiced mead to those faint with grief. They passed whispered prayers to saints for mercy and strength. Nightfall came with a chill that whispered of danger. Injured villagers huddled by makeshift fires, bodies wrapped in blankets torn from damaged homes. Each ember seemed a miracle, defying the chaos. They shared loaves of coarse bread and salted cheese, rationed to last until dawn. And in the circle of flamelight, they spoke of rebuilding, not of stone, but of wood and clay, materials at hand and wielded by muscle and will. When the first light returned, reconstruction began. Fathers felled young trees beyond the ridge, guided by the village carpenter's eye. Mothers mixed clay and straw in earthen pits, kneading it into plaster. Children gathered broken cobblestones from around the wells, hoping to reassemble them. The carpenter, Master Heinrich, oversaw the raising of new timber frames, teaching novices how to square corners and notch joints so they would bear weight. It was slow work, each piece lifted and secured with iron pins, tools hammered by the blacksmith, whose forge still glowed despite the calamity. Over weeks, 4 homes rose again, their frames standing proud against the skyline. New wells were dug by hand, bucket by bucket of earth hauled away at the men's backs. When the clay was dry, walls were whitewashed with lime, gleaned from distant kilns. Roofs were thatched by songs and sweat, bundles of straw packed tight to shelter families once more. By midsummer, the village had forged itself anew, battered but unbroken. Yet the memory of the quake lingered in every heart. In sermons at Sunday Mass, the priest spoke of humility before God's mysterious might. In fields replanted with hardy grain, seeds were sown deeper, furrows made wider, as if to anchor the earth itself. And in the village square, a simple wooden cross was erected near the rebuilt well, a silent testament to their survival, their unity, and the price of solitude when nobility looked away. Modern seismologists believe the quake of 1382 was a magnitude 6 tremor along the Oberpfalz fault line, rare but powerful enough to reshape geology and destiny. In a world without insurance or central aid, these villagers found salvation in common purpose. Their story echoes through centuries as a reminder. When the earth rebels, it is not the stones alone that must endure, but the bonds that hold a community together. And in every battered home, in every repaired well, their legacy stands. A testament to human resilience carved not in marble, but in wood and clay, hand-built, heart-forged, rising again from the very earth that once split beneath them. The miller who hoarded grain and sparked a riot. It was the cruelest winter in living memory. The year was 1335, and famine had stricken the countryside for 2 long years. Fields lay fallow under drifting snow, seed stores had dwindled to dust, and every mouth cried out for even a single grain. In one small village, nestled in the foothills of the Ardennes, the people's despair found a grim symbol in the miller's stone tower. He had once been respected, a burly man with broad shoulders and a booming laugh, who ground their wheat in exchange for a modest fee. But as the famine deepened, rumors whispered through the thatched roofs. Sacks of grain were missing. Flour shipments never arrived. Families went hungry, while the miller's barn remained suspiciously full. The tipping point came on a bitter morning when starving children clawed at their parents' skirts, begging for crumbs. Word spread that the miller was hoarding, hiding entire barrels of grain in secret compartments beneath the millstones, in a loft behind locked doors, inside hollowed logs buried in the yard. Furious whispers grew into shouts. Mothers snatched torches from hearths. Fathers sharpened pitchforks. Pride and fear collided, and the villagers marched as one toward the mill. They came in a ragged crowd of desperate souls. A widow holding her empty bowl like a talisman, a father whose twins lay fevered from hunger, a priest trembling in his snowy robes yet gleaming with righteous anger. At the mill's heavy oak door they pounded, demanding to know why the miller would let them starve while he filled his own coffers. He emerged, face flushed, hands empty. He denied the charges, blamed beggars for stealing the grain, and labeled the villagers as thieves and traitors. That was the spark. A stone flew. A torch was lifted. Soon the thatched roof crackled to flame, and the barn door cracked open under swinging axes. Sacks tumbled into the snow. Golden kernels spilled across frozen earth. Laughter and curses tore through the wind as villagers heaped the precious grain into carts, stuffing their scarves and coats with the promise of life. The miller watched in horror as his livelihood burned. His pleas for mercy were drowned out by the roar of the mob. The older men scooped grain into sacks and helped children carry pails. The women gathered handfuls and scattered them to the starving birds. For a moment, it felt as though justice had been done. But the flames reached higher, and the mill collapsed in a thunderous crash, sending sparks into the night sky like a gory fireworks display. Amid the ashes, the villagers dug through the rubble, retrieving scorched sacks, their edges blackened but kernels intact. They carried them back to the village as if bearing holy relics. Yet, victory turned bitter the next morning. A mounted messenger arrived from the bishopric, bearing a parchment sealed with the church's crest. The entire village was excommunicated. In the eyes of God, they had committed sacrilege. They had destroyed property, stolen from their Lord, and taken justice into their own hands. No sacraments, no burial rites, no absolution. Their sin was so great that even the consecrated ground refused to hold them. Panic replaced triumph. The priest who had marched beside them now cowered in the church nave. Families tore down their own doors, fearing the plague of damnation would spread. Some fled into the woods, leaving behind empty homes and abandoned carts. Others fell to their knees, begging the heavens to restore them to grace. But the bishop's decree stood. It would be months before the church relented. Representatives came, led by a stern abbot carrying a cross and a ledger. They demanded penance. The villagers were to rebuild the mill at their own expense, to pay tithes they could barely afford, and to endure a year of fasting and flagellation. Only then would they be readmitted into the fold. Historians note that the riot marked a turning point in peasant resistance. It was one of the earliest recorded instances of collective action born of starvation, of community solidarity overriding feudal order. Yet it also underlines the perilous boundaries of justice in medieval life. Act too late, and you perish of hunger. Act too rashly, and you risk eternal damnation. For the villagers of 1335, winter's bones ached with hunger. Their souls trembled beneath the church's judgment, and the miller's ashes lay scattered in the frozen yard as a testament to desperation's fierce power. And in the silent aftermath, as the church's bells tolled once more, they understood that in a world ruled by God, King, and Lord, hunger could provoke both mercy and wrath, but rarely forgiveness without price. The bell that rang too late. A raid in broad daylight. It was high noon in 1283 when the market square should have been alive with laughter and haggling voices. Summer heat draped over cobblestones as merchants displayed bolts of cloth and baskets of ripening fruit. Families strolled among stalls. Children darted between legs. The bell tower stood silent above it all, its lone guard slumped against the wooden railing, lulled by the sun and the promise of empty skies. But silence breeds complacency, and complacency invites disaster. From the east road came dust clouds on the horizon. First one, then two, then a dozen. Raiders, mounted men with cruel intent, their armor etched with the scars of past plunders. They laughed as they rode, urging their beasts into a triumphal gallop that shattered the idle peace. No warning rang out to the villagers. The guard, dreaming of lunch, did not hear the thunder of hooves until arrows thumped into the market stalls. He bolted upright, heart slamming in his throat. But half the men were already among the tables, swords swirling in sunbeams, boots trampling wares and bodies alike. With shaking hands, the guard seized the rope. He pulled once, twice. His muscles screamed, but a bell this size needed force. On the third heave, the clapper struck the bronze, and a hollow clang shattered the midday calm. It was too late. By the time the echoes reached the edges of the square, the raiders had looted every merchant's chest. Grain sacks lay torn, cloth lay scattered like confetti. Horses neighed as riders snatched up stolen goods and prodded their mounts toward the village gates. Behind them, villagers lay wounded or dead. Mothers clutching infants. Farmers with scythes still in trembling hands. Friends and neighbors fallen with no time even to curse. Panic spread like wildfire. Those who'd slept through the first assault now ran with screams of terror, seeking cover behind wagons or within empty stalls. Some hurled stones. Others threw themselves at riders, desperation fueling their strength. But steel and surprise were merciless. Shields splintered, bone shattered. Half the market's souls perished that day, clustered beneath wooden awnings or back against the church wall, their blood blossoming like dark roses on the stones. The bell's toll finally brought reinforcements. 2 mounted sergeants from the nearest garrison miles away. They charged in, swords drawn, but only to witness retreat. The raiders, their horses laden with plunder, melted away down the same dusty road, leaving ruin in their wake. The survivors knelt among the broken stalls, weeping for the lost and for the warning that had come moments too late. Chroniclers later wrote of that raid in the annals of Poitiers. They noted that 300 men attacked, 60 died defending home and harvest, and more than 100 merchants' livelihoods vanished on a single afternoon. They attributed the disaster not merely to the raiders' cruelty, but to the guards' torpor, a reminder that vigilance cannot rest. In the weeks that followed, the village reeled under grief and guilt. Fields lay unharvested at its edge, farmers too ashamed or afraid to return. The church bell, once a symbol of security, hung silent and lonely. It became custom for every villager, young and old, to gather each morning in the square and ring it together, fingers bleeding on the rope, voices raw from song and prayer, so that no one would again mistake peace for safety. But wounds fester. In cold months, when the sky turned steel and hunger bit into bellies, resentment lurked in every heart. Some blamed the guard, accusing him of sleep indulgence. Others blamed the Lord for failing to station more knights. A few spoke in hushed tones of revenge, of tracking down the raiders, of fire and blood for blood. The bell tower guard was reassigned, sent to a remote watch at the border, never to ring that bell again. He carried guilt like an iron yoke, each dawn haunted by the clanging that came too late. Years later, When war again roared through the region, that village was spared further massacres, but it never forgot the midday slaughter. Even now, if you wander through that square, you'll find the bell's clapper replaced and polished, the rope well worn by pilgrims' hands. And perhaps, if the wind is right, you'll hear it, the lone tone echoing across empty fields, a warning etched in bronze and memory. Vigilance is no burden too heavy when the price of slumber is death.